Welcome to Accommodations 101 training. This training will be divided into two parts. Part 1 will cover the purpose of accommodations, how to read the TEA policy documents, and which accommodations are most frequently assigned in Humble ISD. Part 2 will cover the accessibility features and designated supports. The material covered in this training is based on policies established by the Texas Education Agency for the 2018 testing calendar year. These changes go into effect in January and do not impact December 2017 STAR EOC retesting. For the purposes of this presentation, the term accommodations will be used interchangeably with accessibility features and designated supports. When considering accommodations for a student, always consider why it is needed, and remember, accommodations are not intended to give a student an advantage, but rather level the playing field. In other words, accommodations should not be used if the purpose is for the student to achieve a higher passing score than peers with similar abilities not receiving accommodations, but rather the purpose of the accommodations should be to give the student the same opportunity to achieve a score similar to peers that do not receive accommodations. As we progress through this training, we will refer to non-identified students in addition to special education, ELL, and 504 students. Non-identified students are those that are currently not served by special education, 504, or as an ELL student, but receive assistance in the classroom as part of the RTI process. Their progress is typically being closely monitored by teachers and/or other staff at the campus. TEA's policy documents have several basic components. First is a description of the designated support. After the description, you will find which assessments the designated support can be used on. Remember that not all designated supports can be used on all assessments. For example, oral administration cannot be used with TOPAS even if the student has an oral administration for Reading STAR. Each designated support has a TEA document which provides a description, eligibility criteria, authority for decision, examples and types, and any special considerations. Terms routinely, independently, and effectively are used in this presentation. The student must receive this support during classroom instruction and classroom testing. If an RTI, LPAC, 504, or special ed committee has made a designated support available to the student, this support must be reflected online or on the answer documents. The eligibility criteria that students must meet in order to qualify for the accommodation will also be carefully outlined on each policy document. When looking at these documents, it is important to make note of the word and places the word or may come into play. For example, in the criteria shown here, the student must routinely and effectively use the accommodation in the classroom and is unable to use any other accessibility features or designated supports to address the need. Also, they must meet at least one of the items in the final list of criteria. This is where the word or should be in your mind. In addition to the first two criteria, they must also be an English language learner or a visually impaired student or a dyslexic student or a student with documented evidence of reading difficulties, and so on. Remember, there are no longer specific linguistic accommodations, but rather ELLs are included in the policy documents used for special education, 504, and non-identified students. It is extremely important that decision makers are aware of the accommodations that will block an ELL from being exited if made available on the Reading and/or Writing STAR. Those are extra time, oral administration, and content and language supports. When an LPAC is deciding on accommodations for a student that is highly likely to meet the exit criteria of the ELL program, they should refrain from providing extra time, oral administration, and language and vocabulary support to that student on a state assessment. Additionally, a student that is eligible due to documented evidence of a reading difficulty may be a non-identified student currently served by RTI. The policy documents will also outline who has the authority to make decisions about accommodations for a student and what documentation is required both in advance of testing as well as following state testing. For non-identified students, decisions concerning accommodations need to be made by the appropriate campus level team or committee. The Campus Designated Support Accessibility Features form for non-identified students, as shown here, must be completed and saved for future reference. For ELL students that are also special education or 504, accommodations must be made by the applicable committee in conjunction with the student's LPAC. All accommodations decisions must then be documented in both the ELL record and the records of the other group. This means that accommodations for dually served students must be documented both in EastBed and in Elevation. If necessary, the policy documents will contain special instructions and/or considerations related to the implementation of the specific accommodation. This section will provide the do's and don'ts of using the accommodation and guidance for what implementation should look like on testing day. Some accommodation policy documents will include a section that outlines examples or types of activities and materials to be used with implementation. It should be noted that the list provided is usually not limited to the items on the list, but rather is intended to provide guidance to campus staff as to how to implement the accommodation on a daily basis and on test day. Some examples, however, are an exhaustive list, meaning that you can only provide the examples listed on the policy document. The list shown here represents the most frequently assigned accommodations in Humble ISD. One or more were made available to approximately 9% of students testing during the spring 2017 STAR administrations in grades 3 all the way through the high school EOCs. A calendar has been created for deadlines of assessment decisions. Any ARD, 504, RTI, or LPAC decisions made after the deadlines will not be in effect for the upcoming administration. The next section of training will cover the accessibility features. Accessibility features may be provided to any student on STAR, STAR Spanish, and TELPAS based on their individual needs. The student should regularly use the feature during classroom instruction and testing. A student cannot be required to use a prescribed accessibility feature, and there is no documentation needed on the student's answer document. Depending on the feature, a student may need to complete the test in a separate setting in order to minimize disruptions to other students and ensure the security and confidentiality of the assessment. There are 2 accessibility features that assist students with understanding the test administration directions. A test administrator can sign test administration directions for a deaf or hearing impaired student. Additionally, a test administrator can translate the test administration directions into the native language of an English language learner. This is a complete list of accessibility features approved for 2018. New features added include a sticky note tool for the online system. Also, amplification devices and projection devices, which in 2017 were designated supports, are now considered an accessibility feature. Several strategies are available to assist students that are more challenged by distractions in the testing environment. Students can be placed into a small group for the test administration or can be assessed individually. Students can be reminded to stay on task as frequently as needed. For some students, a tool to minimize distractions may be helpful. This would include access to a stress ball, wearing noise-canceling headphones, or even listening to instrumental music through individual headphones. It should be noted that any music that a student listens to cannot contain lyrics. In certain situations, the read aloud of certain test components may be helpful. Any student can read aloud the test to themselves in order to improve accessibility. This may include using a recording device to record into and play back the test, or speaking into a PVC pipe, known as a whisper phone, that funnels the sound to a student's ear. On a writing assessment, the test administrator may read aloud or assign the writing prompt to any student that asks for that assistance. On the Grade 3 Mathematics test, any student can have a word, phrase, or sentence read aloud to them. However, if a student needs the entire Grade 3 math test read aloud, they must meet the eligibility criteria for the designated support of an oral administration. Also, all test administrators giving the Grade 3 Mathematics test must be trained to give an oral admin and must sign the bottom section of the oath. There are several test-taking tools available to students to increase accessibility to the assessments. These include use of scratch paper, colored overlays, place markers, magnifying devices, highlighters, colored pencils, or crayons. In the online testing platform, students have a color setting, guideline tool, and zoom feature. Any surface that can be erased or destroyed can serve as scratch paper. This would include working problems on a dry erase board, using tracing paper, colored paper, white paper, lined paper, etc. On the math, science, and social studies assessments, a bilingual dictionary can be used as an accessibility feature. This dictionary must contain word-to-word translations only and cannot contain definitions or examples. It should be noted that documentation in eSped or Elevation of this accessibility feature, along with the language needed, may be requested in order for campus testing coordinators to adequately plan for testing. It is important that staff members who work with students who will need a bilingual dictionary communicate language information to the appropriate campus administrator. Something that is a change for 2018 concerns amplification devices and projection devices. In the past, both of these were considered designated supports. Beginning in 2018, these two accommodations will be considered accessibility features and available to any student who regularly and effectively benefits from as a part of classroom instruction. This is the end of training on the policy documents and accessibility features. The next training, which is a separate training, is going to cover the designated supports.